What is the purpose of the Jedi Order? I'm pretty sure you can think of many. Like exploring and studying the Force, preventing the dark side from rising and taking over the galaxy, or even keeping the cosmic force in balance. I mean, these are noble-sounding goals which are fit for a very noble organization. But the true purpose of the Jedi Order is a bit more simple than that. It's more relatable and grounded in, I guess, human or sentient nature. You see, the true purpose of the Jedi Order is basically survival and fitting in. Let me explain. If you really think about it, what are the Jedi and the Sith? What are Force users to the rest of the galaxy? They're like gods amongst normal beings, superheroes, individuals with divergent DNA perhaps, which allowed them to do astonishing things. You could almost say that Force users were like mutants, special, but also very different, and if the right narrative is at play in the galaxy, they were also extremely terrifying.
I've heard 100 stories about the Jedi. They terrified me as a boy on Coruscant, but you...
Now granted, Del Meeko grew up during the Galactic Empire's reign. And the Empire was controlled by the Sith, who rolled out huge propaganda efforts to label the Jedi as evil beings with far too much power and control. Palpatine would use historical revisionism, lies, and caricatures to attack the Jedi Order's name, but he would also lean on some truths that were kind of worrying about the Jedi. You see, the Jedi were powerful. They were in many ways without any checks and balances. The Jedi were not elected by the public. They were born into this order and immediately given special rights because of who they were. For instance, the Jedi were not held accountable to the judicial order, the same order that the Jedi served in. Instead, they had their own internal review process, as was the case when Ahsoka Tano was framed for bombing the Jedi Temple on Coruscant. Instead of being tried by a civilian court or a military tribunal, because Ahsoka Tano technically had an officer's commission within the Grand Army of the Republic, Ahsoka would be tried before the High Jedi Council, who had the jurisdiction in this case. This council was not a democratic entity. Its members selected who would join the council, and not even the average Jedi in the Order had much say about that. Let alone the taxpayers who are basically funding the Jedi Order and the judicial department they serve in. In the case of Ahsoka Tano and the Jedi Temple bombing, in order to seem less biased, the Jedi Order essentially expel Ahsoka Tano so that the Republic military could put her on trial instead. It's kind of telling that the Jedi are so worried about public sentiment about their order should they choose to protect Ahsoka Tano that they don't even really investigate her case and figure out who actually bombed the Jedi Temple. Ahsoka Tano's hearing in front of the Jedi Council was more about how she had become a liability for the Order rather than a true trial on whether she actually committed the crime she was accused of. Now, as a pragmatist, this was probably the right decision. The fact that the Jedi were not held accountable to the same rules and regulations as everyone else was a troubling thing, and I think a lot of the older members of the Jedi kind of understood this. They understood the true purpose of the Jedi Order. A purpose that was so important that they were willing to throw Ahsoka to the wolves rather than stand by their principles. For the Jedi, far more terrifying than the Sith taking over the galaxy was the prospect that non-Force sensitives would stop trusting the Jedi and turn against them. All it'll take is one effective populist leader to have a grudge against the Jedi, and suddenly, people will begin to start looking at this weird relationship that the Jedi have with the Republic. Forget about the whole Jedi overthrowing the government during the Clone Wars situation. What if people started believing that the Jedi and Sith were just too powerful to be left alone? What if people believed that they needed some type of documentation? Maybe all Force sensitives have to be registered with the Republic. Kind of like that holocron the Jedi had with all of the Force-sensitive babies in the galaxy that Cad Bane tried to steal, but even more comprehensive and in the hands of the Republic judicial forces. There also would be a task force, a specially trained and armed task force that dealt with these super beings. Up until this point, the Jedi Order had experienced immunity from the political world and also from the news media, but now people are going to start looking a bit closer, especially at their finances. I mean, where are the Jedi getting their money? Where are they raising money? And what exactly is their relationship to the Republic? And what checks and balances are in place to make sure that these guys don't go crazy? And as the Republic government begins to escalate their control of Force users, it is probably inevitable that these Republic soldiers or peacekeepers will run into an unruly Force user, most likely a darksider, and there will be a massacre of some sort. At which point, the battle in the galaxy no longer will be about the dark side versus the light side, the Sith versus the Jedi. It'll be about Force sensitives versus non-Force sensitives. First, there's just one incident, and then there's a retaliation, and then there's another retaliation, and then soon it'll be pretty normal to see Sith Lords wielding lightning blasting away entire groups of Republic soldiers on TV, or a Jedi using a mind trick on a unit of peacekeepers. As more and more individuals are affected, more civilians will turn eventually against these Force sensitives, creating an environment for persecution and war. Remember, there aren't really that many Jedi or Sith in the galaxy. The birth of a Force user was generally seen as a very rare occurrence for most species. And so most people's opinions about Force users were not shaped by first-hand experiences. Instead, it was usually shaped by holodramas and accounts from other people. Now imagine if fear rather than respect became the main emotion that non-Force users had for the Jedi and Sith. If you think about it, for most of the Jedi's history, they had this holier-than-thou attitude, which basically made them immune from public scrutiny. And again, a lot of the political and news institutions refused to touch this subject matter because of that. But slowly, once that illusion is shattered, you would start to see discrimination, new laws, checks and balances, limitations, but eventually it would turn into open warfare. And Force users, despite their many talents, would be quickly overwhelmed and outnumbered, especially those stupid enough to stand and fight. Other Force users would refuse to fight, of course. They would get locked up and thrown into prison camps. Some might even help the Republic round up other Force users. You never know. Which kind of leads us to this gray and dark future where all Force users are either locked up in specially designed prison camps or living in exile in small little groups. In these prison camps, Force users are going to be cataloged, detained, and eventually studied. I mean, forget about this X-Men prison. The Republic already had their own specially designed Force user prison known as the Citadel. For most of the Galactic Republic's history, the Jedi had a monopoly over all research on Force-related materials like kyber crystals, for instance. They controlled the mines, and they controlled the scientific research. You had individuals like Galen Erso who really wanted to get his hands on some kyber crystals, but it wasn't until after Order 66 that he was able to finally take a look at a few and develop that super laser. With the Jedi out of the picture, now you had plenty of corporations that I'm sure would love to get their hands on some Jedi blood or Sith blood, or maybe some of those kyber crystals they're using as well. I mean, this is the true fear, I think, of every Force user. From a young age, they probably realize how different they are. I mean, this is before they realize that they have superpowers that make them essentially gods. When they're very young, the Force just makes them feel different and alone. Now that is kind of at the root of everything. Even though the Star Wars galaxy is a very diverse place full of all sorts of alien beings, some who have very superior traits in their own right, but at the same time, there's really nothing like a Jedi or a Sith in the Star Wars galaxy. Now, the Sith were a bit different in how they approached this Force user versus non-Force user problem. I mean, they were a bit more realistic about it, perhaps a little bit too realistic, and they simply just enslaved the entire non-Force sensitive population. This is why most Sith rulers led as authoritarians at the head of an empire of some sort. The Sith actively taught people that Force users were in fact superior and godlike compared to the normies. They kind of embraced their role in the social hierarchy, I guess. And that suppression would work until the Jedi or the Republic eventually would defeat them. Now, the Jedi Order had a much more interesting tactic that they used to make sure they would be safe from the masses, and that was by cultivating an almost religious-like aura around their organization. This is why the Jedi Order had so many different restrictions and rules. It was all about cultivating this image that they were holier than thou. I mean, these weren't just mutants, these were a holy order of monks. The Jedi were infallible when it came to their moral judgment, and they always put the needs of the Republic and others before their own wishes and desires. The Jedi swore off love. They didn't have kids, unless, they were the starchy kind. They stayed out of politics, and they tried to stay as impartial as possible. And they would serve the judicial branch of the Republic and help the Chancellor maintain order in the galaxy. This is also probably a reason why the Jedi had no legal framework or official role within the Republic, despite being definitely a part of the Republic. I think it's just that, paperwork is not cool and mysterious like the Jedi. Instead, the Jedi were just there. They had a almost holy duty to the Republic, and they pretty much did their own thing and would befriend many administrations and many Supreme Chancellors. You can actually think of them as one of the most ancient special interest groups within the Senate. All of the limitations that the Jedi put on their members, like tracking all Force sensitives, including ones that don't join the Order, preventing recruits from being close to their family, or only allowing newborns to start training, were all designed to make sure that the Jedi didn't have any accidents. Accidents like Dooku, or Barriss Offee, or Ponkrell. Because all it took was one bad apple to completely change how the whole entire galaxy viewed Force users. This is what led to the Jedi Order's ban of all dark side related material within the Jedi Temple. Young Jedi were not taught how to identify the dark side or what to do when they encounter it. Instead, the whole subject was just not allowed to be spoken of. Which is stupid, because the dark side wasn't just some evil force that existed in certain parts of the galaxy. Every living being possessed the dark side of the force inside of them. True harmony really could only be found when a Jedi could balance their exposure between the light and dark side. You know, in the Skywalker saga, especially in the prequels, the Jedi are portrayed as a very powerful and wise organization, but I think there's always been this other side of the Jedi and all Force users. You know, especially before they put the robes on and they join these institutions, which are designed to protect them from the masses. Before that, they're just kind of mutant freaks. You know, they have special powers, but they are very different from your average person, and they're definitely a very small minority when you consider the larger galactic population. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our content. My name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance to the Republic, to democracy.